The Perambulation of Dartmoor. A rather fancy name for an ancient route. The Perambulation was first trodden in 1240 by a posse of 12 knights on a mission from the king to circumnavigate the whole of the Forest of Dartmoor. This 50-mile-long circuit sent its perambulators through some of Dartmoor's most beautiful and most bleak landscapes, over its highest tors and steepest hills, through its treacherous mires and across its racing rivers. This was not a quest for the faint of heart, but for the valiant.
Hello and welcome to the Dartmoor podcast. It's not a podcast. 2025 Dartmoor Perambulation.
Dartmoor's ancient boundary perambulation.
The route of the perambulation is kept alive today by the Dartmoor Bounders, who offer a stitch badge and a certificate for anyone stalwart enough to complete the walk. And we all know I covet a stitch badge. Could my beardy brother and I follow in the footsteps of those brave knights? And more importantly, could we enjoy it? We had 4 days set aside in a supposedly dry early August to backpack camp and stomp the boundaries of Dartmoor Forest. But would it be all bogs, blisters and bickering, or blue skies, beauty and brotherly love? Come along with us as we put the ramble in perambulate, on my most ambitious mission yet. Welcome back to the Dartmoor podcast. It began on a warm, sunny Saturday morning. Perfect walking conditions, with Brother James planning to leave the car at our start point, Princetown, where it would hopefully still be parked on our return in 4 days' time. Our first checkpoint was the TV mast that looms above the town on North Hessery Tor. It was a very visual reminder of how much has changed since the original perambulation. Obviously the TV mast wasn't here, but neither was the entire village, which has sprung up since around the notorious prison. If you're a bit of a history dunce like me, then probably the best way to describe the world of 1240 is Robin Hood times. Which is kind of silly naming a historical era after a fictional character, but I think it delivers all the details you need. A country of archers, friars, outlaws and sheriffs. A peasant class subject to draconian laws and crushing taxation to pay for the king's expensive wars abroad. Of the 12 knights which set out on this journey, James would be representing Henry, son of Henry, because he has a funny name, and I would be representing William Trenchard. As his name suggests, he might be related to my Dartmoor hero, the Reverend Sabin Baring Gould. And we were about to meet a couple of other nobles to set us on the right track. Billy Brewer and Dick Gippard, better known as William Le Brewer and Richard of Gifford, better known as Ratboy and Mabel, letterboxers extraordinaire. This pair were to lead us up the crumbling summit of Great Mist Tor and point us on our way, Ratboy being one of the few people I know who has completed the perambulation himself. And, of course, it would be rude not to pick up a few boxes while in the presence of the maestro, and edge my way towards another Dartmoor stitch badge for finding 100 boxes. If you also desire such a prize or are intrigued by the concept of secretive hidden stamps on the moor, then you could do a lot worse than begin by having a look at his YouTube channel dedicated to letterboxing. I always find Great Miss one of Dartmoor's most impressive tours, and standing at the summit looking north towards the vast empty waste ahead of us was the moment that the daunting scale of this adventure really hit home. Stengator, where I planned for us to camp that evening, seemed a very distant prospect, out beyond Tavy Cleeve, Fir Tor and the Rattlebrook, some of the most remote parts of Dartmoor. Not without a coffee first, and luckily Beardy Brother makes the best camping coffee this side of the Alps with his little portable French press. And as we sat and sipped our rocket fuel, Ratboy had a little surprise. An envelope that was only to be opened if we completed the route.
Hey, cheers! Do you see any sort of path?
It was time to get moving, as James and I had a lot of ground to cover, first needing to cross the River Walkham and head north towards White Barrow and Lynch Tor. Our knightly counterparts would not, though, have had to walk on foot all those years ago. They would ride, and likely have a train of servants and squires in tow with any equipment they might need. Why did the 1240 perambulation happen? At its root, it was a consequence of England's ongoing crusades and a long war with France, both of which were putting huge financial strain on the country. In 1204, bad King John, in an attempt to raise some cash, disafforested Devon. Basically, the West Country, which had been the king's by right since the Norman invasion, was sold off to its various landowners, raising 5,000 marks. Anyway, for some reason John decided to not quite give up the whole of Devon, excluding Dartmoor and Exmoor from the sale, and keeping them as royal forests. And for anyone who's ever been confused about the barren Dartmoor being called a forest, in this context a forest was an area of wild land in which the king, and only the king, had a right to hunt game. Anyone else caught hunting a deer or a boar within the boundaries of a forest would be liable for horrific punishment or even death. Furthermore, anyone wanting to graze their livestock inside the forest would need to pay a fee. So the perambulation was, effectively, a legal exercise in once and for all confirming exactly where the edge of Dartmoor lay, and was ordered by King John's successor, Henry II. On our clockwise walk, anything to mine and James's right belonged to the king, no touching. Anything to our left, fair game, which is the literal origin of that phrase. If you were a medieval peasant out looking for a bit of venison, it would be a matter of life and death knowing which side of the border that deer was on. Eventually, after a bit of rough terrain, we made it to the wonky little stack of Lynch Tor, which strangely seemed to be harbouring a swarm of bees.
Murdered by bees wasn't one of the things I thought could go wrong.
The next section of the walk would take us to the end of Tavy Cleeve and along the river. I had a bit of a suspicion that this could be a difficult stretch as we were getting into some of the more remote parts of the moor and paths might be non-existent. Although I'd spent a bit of time researching the history of the perambulation and a few places of interest along the way, I deliberately shied away from meticulously planning the route beyond drawing a nice red line on my map. This would mean that there was a bit more adventure navigating the route, but also meant that we would, inevitably, have to suffer through some overgrown or boggy terrain, which gave it more the feel of a Geo-Wizard straight-line mission in places, rather than a historical hike. Tired of long grass and not particularly feeling diving into a sea of waist-high bracken, James and I decided to take a little bit of an alternative route here, dropping down to the river early, crossing Amicum Brook and following its eastern bank downstream into the valley of the Rattlebrook. A wild, daunting and beautiful place, our detour had some of its own challenges, and would have been impossible if the river was in spate. But it was definitely the preferable route for those with coconut husks instead of horses. At the confluence of the streams, we almost took a completely wrong turning, but luckily I gave the compass a little check. Getting lost would be an unnecessarily demoralising addition to the day. Instead, we sat down for a minute and enjoyed the quiet of that beautiful and remote gorge, blissfully unaware that things were going to start getting much more difficult. From this point, the knights followed the Rattlebrook all the way to its source, aiming between the distant landmarks of Green Tor and Lower Dunnergoat. Yes, it's really called that. And although the views back down Tavy Cleeve were initially impressive, this would turn out to be a nightmarish stream to follow on an overgrown summer's day. One particularly misjudged shortcut across damp, grassy and uneven ground left me with wet feet that I would now get to enjoy for a further 3 days. This was a gruelling part of our journey, but there was nothing to do except dig our toes into the earth and slowly pull the horizon towards us.
Scale.
Some of the stuff we're going, we're on a path now, isn't a path.
Eventually we made it to Bleak House, a ruin situated along the stream and between the aforementioned tors.
Yeah, so this was the house of the manager of the peat works that was here.
Okay. Isn't that a job for future George?
Yes, James, thank you. Bleak House was the home of the manager of the peat cutting works here in the 19th century, and I have to wonder how little trust he had in his employees that he chose to live out here rather than just spring the odd random inspection. No thanks, I'm both spatially and temporally unable to accept a what's it. Thanks though. On again, the final leg of the first day. And things began superbly with an actual path brightening our spirits.
Perfect.
Until it disappeared into a rank puddle.
That's horrible. Skanky water as well.
We were headed for Stengator, a rocky outcrop perching above the deep and steep East Oakmont Valley. But getting to this final waypoint would prove to be the toughest walking of the day, if not the entire perambulation. Classic Dartmoor pathless millennia desert, where the ground is both ankle-turningly uneven and hidden from view, making every step a mentally and physically exhausting blind balancing act. And to add insult to injury, we would frequently stumble across beautiful paths which we crossed at right angles rather than followed. Which, when you think about it, makes perfect sense. This was one of several psychogeographical revelations which would occur to me walking this ancient route. Paths on Dartmoor naturally lead either across the moor or in and out of it for the use of farmers or the military and so on. So the very nature of circumnavigating it would mean that you'd be crossing rather than following these trails. The same applies to all of Dartmoor's major rivers, which we would need to cross at some point on our trek. Anyway, following our antipath, we struggled the last kilometre to Stengatoris, itself a small granite island in a marshy puddle of reeds, and gratefully collapsed to take in the breathtaking views over the East Oakmont. It also afforded a view of the incredibly long and steep climb we would need to make tomorrow up the other side, but now was not the time to be thinking of such things. Instead, we picked our way down the almost vertical slope to the flat, grassy valley below and found a place to pitch our tents. By the time we'd stuffed down some noodles and slurped a hip flask of whiskey, it was getting on, and the exhausting progress of the last few hours meant that an early night was most welcome. After a night of sleep quite effectively disturbed by bickering foxes running up and down the valley, we awoke to a much more typically Dartmoor kind of morning, with fog and drizzle painting the moors into a hazy and haunting picture of bleakness.
You were sort of like just doing up your shoelaces and just everything just went a shade yellowier, lighter. I think that was the beautiful sunrise just happened.
And such a day would begin by climbing to the highest point on the entire moor, the ridge of the High Willays and Yes Tor which towered over us to our east, its summit lost in the cloud. 200 metres of elevation, wind-flung mist and wet feet aren't everyone's ideal start to the day, it must be said, and there was a particularly crushing moment when what appeared to be the top materialised out of the mist, only for me to realise it was Fordsland's Ledge, a small outcrop about halfway up. But eventually, after rudely awakening some other hardy campers with my coconuts, we reached Dartmoor's highest peak. A first for James, who would not, on this occasion, be able to enjoy the views.
Highest place in the south of England. Can't see more than 50 feet in any direction.
We would, though, rendezvous with another nobleman who would guide us through our first stage of the day. Dave, from Dave Does Hiking. Dave chose to represent the night with by far the coolest name, Adonis of Treverbin. Now, many of you will think that Treverbin bit sounds a bit Cornish, and you'd be right, with Odo being one of the more interesting knights who undertook the original quest. Because, as it turns out, this perambulation of the forest wasn't for the king at all. Henry II had gifted Dartmoor to his younger brother Richard, the Earl of Cornwall, who kept causing trouble and rising in rebellion. A sort of extremely lavish gift to keep him from causing any more bother.
Bliss.
Adonis of Treverbin was likely a close relative or friend of Richard, and there to oversee the things done in his interest. As a little side nugget of information, only a king's hunting ground should be called a forest, so technically Dartmoor Forest should be called Dartmoor Chase. There you go. Dave was a great companion to get us moving on such a bleak morning, and made the observation that he had cunningly joined us for the easy bits along the military roads that criss-cross North Dartmoor. Mine and James's joy at walking on proper paths was palpable, and we made excellent time over this early stretch. Dave's an excellent navigator, and if you're planning a Dartmoor walk and want to get the scoop on the route, it's well worth checking out his channel. And as he guided us through the mist, I thought about how it was very much in the spirit of the original Perambulation to take advice and direction. The knights would have talked to local moormen as they went in order to fully negotiate the boundaries of the forest. Personally, I love the moor when it's like this. I find it wonderfully atmospheric. But it was a shame that James would be denied some of the wild and scenic vistas that it had to offer. The day was due to clear up later, but that might not mean too much if we were high enough to literally be in the clouds. We would have to hope for the best, but expect the worst. Dave left us, rather wisely, underneath Bellstone Common with a few words of advice on how to ford the River Tor and best reach the summit
Dave.
of
Thanks for
Coston
showing
Hill.
us the way around a little bit as well.
No problem.
And yeah, have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Thank you
Words
very
which
much,
we
buddy.
then completely ignored by finding a nice spot for a coffee by the river and a promising looking place to cross. But once on the other side, we had a problem. No paths. It was like a repeat of the previous day's nightmare, but this time with added rain and gradients that made yesterday's trudge to Stengator feel like a stroll to the corner shop. This, for me, was the grimmest moment of the journey, and although James didn't complain at all, I could tell he was quietly wondering what he'd got himself into. Coston Hill, as we now know better than anyone, is Dartmoor's highest hill. I'm not entirely sure I'll ever be able to return without inducing a bout of PTSD. Eventually, though, we did struggle onto the windy summit, where we took what little shelter we could in this ruined hut to recuperate our energy for the next stretch. We were to finally turn south and trek across several high and windswept tors on our way towards the day's conclusion at the Warren House Inn. At this point, with low morale and even lower visibility, I decided it wouldn't be cheating. In fact, it would be entirely in keeping with the spirit of the thing to ask this passing couple if this was the path to Little Houndtor, and indeed it was. Thank you for your help, Guy of Brightville and William of Widworthy. One fascinating aspect of the perambulation is how the boundaries were actually recorded. In 1240 we're a long way away from detailed cartography, so how was the edge of the forest marked out? With a series of meets and bounds, a phrase I'd heard before but never bothered to investigate. A meet, spelt M-E-T-E, is the name given to an immovable waypoint along a route. For instance, the rocks of Little Houndtor, Houndtor and Waterntor, which mark the way along this northeastern stretch. And a bound is the path you take between them, as we have seen usually along a river or the side of a hill or simply a straight line. By recording these meets and bounds accurately in a simple list, the boundary could be legally enforced. The day showed no sign of clearing as we marched on from Tor to Tor. James's waterproof started leaking, and I, for some reason, hadn't even bothered to put mine on. I don't think I really even registered this fine mizzle as rain by Dartmoor standards, but in hindsight, past George looks pretty soggy here. At Wattern Tor we attempted to sit and have a rest, but it was no rest at all, just sitting uncomfortably in the rain. We were making good time and could afford to have a break, but nowhere seemed to be sheltered enough for us to enjoy it, which led to us to just keep marching. Next stop, Manga Rock, a rather unassuming ancient boundary stone which is still used to mark the edge of Gidley parish today. I had an unhappy memory of trying to get to this point a few years back on my north to south mission, getting caught in a load of gorse and bog, but couldn't remember quite where I'd gone wrong. So, with tedious inevitability, I managed to make exactly the same mistake, and we ended up in very hard to traverse terrain again. James had gone a bit quiet, and to be honest, even I wasn't particularly enjoying myself at this point. But just before our spirits were crushed entirely, we dropped into a lush little valley and the sun appeared, beginning to battle the drizzle that had dogged us all day.
It is both hot sun and actual rain. Where's my rainbow at least? Come on.
And as if this wasn't good enough, we had the pleasure of watching a hobby hunting over the river, a small migratory falcon which acrobatically catches and eats dragonflies in mid-air. We crossed the North Tee, jumped a wall and kept on plodding. Although the day had brightened, the damage was done. James had never walked this far in a day before, let alone over such punishing terrain in such miserable weather on top of another long day before. He was keeping a brave face behind that bushy beard, but I began to suspect that he might be having doubts about the rest of the journey when he suggested a shortcut to cut out the Long Stone, a wonderful towering menhir that marked the next meet on the list. From here we actually did take a little bit of a shortcut round the flank of Thornworthy Tor rather than following the edge of Fernworthy Forest itself. By now we had learnt not to scoff at a path if it was heading in even vaguely the right direction. And even though this meant we legally gave the Earl of Cornwall a few extra acres in which to execute peasants, it was clearly the right decision, with the edge of the forest looking very scrubby and hard to traverse. As we began our descent towards the reservoir, I was finally beginning to dry out. Except my feet, they would never dry out. They're still wet now as I record this narration.
James, it's like chilling on the beach down here. It looks great.
Neither Fernworthy Forest itself, nor indeed the reservoir, would have been here in medieval times, and the knights would have ridden right across, but not particularly fancying a swim, we would have to go round. First, though, a rest on the beach.
Yes, that sun feels amazing. Oh, my jumper smells like an old dead goat.
And it was here, sipping our coffee and watching the geese, that James decided that he was going to tap out. Suffering from blisters and fatigue and generally not enjoying the weather and terrain, he'd walk with me to the Warren House Inn for that Guinness, but days 3 and 4 I would be spending alone. A quick stretch for our tired legs, and it was time to finish the day and get to the pub. The only actual forest we walked through in the Forest of Dartmoor was a little oasis of life, and quite a contrast to the desert plains we'd been walking all day. Chiffchaffs, redstarts, and all kinds of other little birds flitted amongst the shrubs along the water's edge, and there was a serene feeling of the day slowly fading as the sun began to sink lower towards the tips of the tall trees. Last push. The drizzle and wind that had battered the right side of our faces all day was replaced with a scorching sun. And in an attempt at motivation, I rather cruelly told James that there was only one last hill. Which wasn't really a lie, it's just that it was Assicombe Hill and would go on forever. With unsteady feet, we'd make the slow plod to the horizon, only to find that it was another false summit, and the broad swathe of tawny grass kept rolling onwards and upwards towards the south. Finally, those familiar white chimneys of Dartmoor's isolated pub peeked into view.
Oh look, that man's got a Guinness.
Yes.
I made a quick diversion to find the mine workings around a feature called King's Oven, where the knights are suspected to have made camp on their first evening, while James went and got the beers in. And let me tell you, that was a well-earned lager right there, looking outwards over the lands to the south of the road, which I would need to conquer the next day. I made a few gentle attempts to rally James. I felt that the rest of the journey would be more sheltered and with better paths, but his feet were in bits. And after we'd looked at the updated weather report promising another drizzly morning followed by a rainstorm in the afternoon, the final nail was hammered into the coffin of James's perambulation attempt. But I wasn't ready to give up yet, even though the weather report was now much worse than it had been when I prepared for the mission. Mrs. Beardy Brother, or Hugh of Bowley as I like to call her, came and collected us from the Warren house. The plan was always that we'd spend the second night back at James's to stuff down a takeaway curry, dry out the tents, charge my podcasting equipment and restock with snacks before beginning where we left off the next morning. So, even though Henry, son of Henry, had fallen, he would still be able to assist me by dropping me back at the Warren House Inn early the next day, and if I were to succeed by rescuing me from Princetown at the end of my adventure. As we drove up from Bovey, predictably the moor grew darker and damper, and by the time we were back at the pub table where we'd enjoyed the pint in the sun the night before, it was time to get the waterproof trousers on. At this point, it was simply the same sort of drizzly low cloud I'd had to deal with the previous day, not too much of a problem. And as I approached Souson's plantation, there were plenty of calm little hollows where it felt like there was no rain at all. As long as I could remain low and sheltered, I shouldn't face too much misery. And besides, I had a plan, which past George shall now relate.
My plan today is, I've got quite an unusual strategy, which is that obviously yesterday it ended up getting quite damp and stuff. Today's looking like it's going to be worse, especially sort of mid-afternoon. It's going to really tip it down. So my plan is march now, get as many miles under my belt as basically like this. Then, as or just before it starts to tip down, put up my tent and have a couple of hours snooze, sit out the rain in the tent this afternoon, and then it's going to be nice and sunny for the last few hours of the day. And I'll march again. Never tried doing something like that before, but I think it is the strategy to survive this third day.
Let's see how that went, shall we? There was no question of giving up. I needed that stitch badge if I were to fill my soggy boots as a proper Dartmoor walker. I love the idea that this historic walk is being kept alive by the Dartmoor bounders, Caroline and Ian, with a map and a list of meets on their website and the opportunity to apply for your prize once you've submitted a short report of your journey to be published online. They told me that people still do the walk, but there's been a slowly waning interest in actually contacting them and getting the badge, which is a shame. If any of you are mad enough to want to do what past George is doing here, then make sure you get in touch with them. Link in the description, as they say. The conifer plantation provided a change of atmosphere among the brooding pines, and the mist whispered slowly along the trails. I was to walk through, then around the forest, to a place called Ephraim's Pinch. Now, I, for some reason, was under the misapprehension that this was the name of the stone circle which lies next to the forest, but after a closer examination of my slowly dissolving map, I realised that it was actually the name of, well, I'm not sure, the top of the hill, maybe? This wasn't a disastrous misnavigation, but it was a gentle warning of things to come. Yesterday, I had the fail-safe of James's GPS to fall back on, and I'd grown complacent and used to his occasional observations that we were drifting off course. But today it was just me, my compass, and what remained of my OS map. And to get back on track, I would have to make a hurried trudge over some very open land, right into the wind, which seemed to be picking up increasing amounts of drizzle and throwing it in my face. I even put my waterproof on. This, I think, is exactly the sort of nonsense James was looking to avoid, and I have a nice little voice note from future Beardy Brother here explaining his thought process, which I will play over some damp and morose-looking livestock.
Hello everybody, it's future James here. Basically, after 2 days of walking a pathless route in sideways rain with blistered feet, I asked myself, why am I even doing this? And do I even care? And the answer was no. I don't care about the route, I don't care about the finisher's badge, I don't care about getting my name on the website, and I don't care about the nights.
As expected, once I was on the roads and lanes over the hills near Cator, walking was much more sheltered, and even my old enemy the bracken would turn out to be an unlikely ally in protecting me from the worst of the rain. Up and over the hill towards a collection of little farms with cool names like Rogue's Roost, I had a moment of righteous ire when confronted with a footpath having been turned into private land, but luckily, although I had to go a little further to go around, there was a good trail, and I reached the hamlet of Sherwell. It seems that the meets on this early part of the southern perambulation revolved less around tors and rivers and more around hamlets and farms, perhaps explaining why I was having a bit more luck with navigable paths. Anyway, the rain hadn't set in properly yet, so I'd keep on marching and making good time. Unlike this duck. But, oh dear, I remembered the name of Babony from looking at the map earlier and marched straight up through the farm before realising that the context in which I'd remembered the name Babony was "don't go into Babony," and had to turn back. Where was Beardy Brother when I needed him? I don't feel too daft about missing the correct path though, as it was completely obscured in this overgrown and woody little valley. But once on the path, things were great. A lovely walk along the River Dart, sheltered enough by trees and the shadow of Yartor that I could even sit and make a cup of tea and slurp it gratefully by the water's edge. And following the river downstream meant that even I couldn't get waylaid here, eventually making it to Dartmeet, which was surprisingly busy given that the day was dreary and only scheduled to get worse. Much worse. Through the village and over that beautiful bridge, but not across the iconic stepping stones, instead turning uphill. And this part of the walk had almost the opposite issue of yesterday's pathless meandering. No entry signs on every gate funnelled me down one very specific route among tall hedges and farm walls. It was a bit confining, but at least I wasn't getting lost or floundering in bogs. Yet I was about to meet an obstacle. Cows in the way. Hello. I'd like to get past, please. What's the best way through? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Good cows. It's okay. It's alright, good cows. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. Bovine guardians of the perambulator's path vanquished, I hopped over a stile into a beautiful little oak wood, complete with a cascading stream. This would be a nice place to rest, and as I started to construct my stove to make a cuppa, Dartmoor decided to send in the rain. This was a bit earlier in the day than I had planned to put my cunning shelter plan into action, but the location was good, so I threw up my lanchan and dived in. This beautiful copse is absolutely not in the permitted purple zone of the camping map, but when does sheltering end and camping begin, hey? I was simply hunkering down to avoid a soaking. I ate some lunch and made some notes for future George on the adventure so far, but without a good book, my usual camping companion, there's only so much eating and admin one can manage before beginning to lose their lonely mind.
Oh, sorry. Would you like one, James?
Anyway, I dozed off for an hour and awoke at 4 p.m. to the unusual sound of, well, the absence of the sound of rain. Tentatively, I emerged into the sunlight.
It could be a trick.
I dried out my stuff a little in the sun, then got back on the road. Rested and, frankly, a little smug that my plan had worked so well, I attacked the next stage of the journey with gusto, despite it being a whole lot of uphill. I was at an advantage from Saddle Bridge as my walk briefly overlapped with the William Crossing walk I'd completed last year with Supermax Piper, and I remembered that we'd crossed a wobbly stile a little down the road. It makes me shudder to think how many shortcuts and easy paths I'd missed over the last few days by not having these little nuggets of local knowledge. And although it was a tough climb up and away from the riverside farmlands, one advantage of increased elevation is, of course, the views. In the early evening light, the world was as fresh and sweet and sparkling as anyone could wish. And from the edge of Down Ridge, satisfyingly, I could see back to a number of the landmarks I'd already stomped over on my way to this point. My end goal for this evening was to make it past Dartmoor's Snowdon Hill and find a place to camp somewhere near the River Avon, but before this I would have one more river crossing. And here was some pretty bad terrain. The valley bottom around the O Brook was proper sedgy swamp and would have been completely impassable, I expect, at a less dry time of year. But I struggled across and started the climb up the far side, following the perambulator's route alongside the tributary of Dry Lake, which is neither dry nor a lake. Wet Stream would be a more accurate name, I suppose. To refuel after this climb, and possibly to stall before another round of what looked like lumpy grass hell, I munched an apple under the jealous eyes of some ponies. Then it was onwards and upwards to the highest point on South Dartmoor, Riders Hill, and its long, wind-swept, sun-bleached ridge which stretched south towards the triple cairns of Snowdon. The evening sun brought a sense of elation. The worst of my journey was now surely behind me, and it would take something really terrible to keep me from getting back to Princetown the next day and claiming my status as a Dartmoor perambulator. I'd struggled over most of the route's most barren places, stormed its highest points, and even outwitted the weather. But at the same time I was weary and wet-footed and longing for a sheltered place to camp and rest my legs. And here, I think, in a bit of a rush to get out of the wind, I went a little bit wrong, somehow wandering through rather than round Huntingdon Warren, the remains of a rabbit farming enterprise from the Victorian era. Not too far off track though, and it seemed fair to give the common folk some land back after giving the king a few extra yards the day before around the edges of Fernworthy. Anyway, I reached an absolutely perfect spot, flat, sheltered, supplied with water, and even with its own protective charm, Huntingdon Cross. I had no idea whether this was in the permitted camping zone, but my little legs weren't going any further. And besides, setting up at this time of the evening, and leaving as I intended early the next day, would mean that no one would even know. Except you lot, of course. As it turns out, I was actually about 3 metres inside the permitted zone, with the boundary being this wall, so it's all good. I had just time to set up camp before the sun disappeared behind the hills, then I stuffed down a gourmet dinner of instant noodles and was asleep before my head hit the ground.
Good night. Back in the morning. Night, James.
And what a morning to awake to. Time to drink a quick cuppa that only tasted slightly of vegetable curried noodles, pack up and get walking. My final day should, in theory, be my easiest, but I needed to be at the extraction point in Princetown by 4, so couldn't afford to dawdle or get lost. Or indeed spend time retrieving fallen comrades.
James! James! No, come back, James! James, I'm sorry!
The first climb of the day is always the worst, and I made this even more gruelling by picking another terrible pathless route to the summit of Eastern White Barrow, or the Dartmoor Submarine as it's affectionately known. Now, one of the interesting things about the perambulation is that the evidence of the route the Knights took is a little more than a single scroll with 31 meets listed on it. And many of these meets have names that are a little ambiguous in nature, being as they were written in a sort of Latin Middle English hodgepodge. So there is some debate as to the correct route. A good example is Esterwitteberg, which we assume is Eastern White Barrow, even though Ester doesn't mean east at all. So to be on the safe side, I stomped over Western White Barrow too, even though it was a few metres off the accepted trail. And I marched on, round and under one of my favourite landmarks, the looming sky tip of the Dartmoor volcano, the remains of the clay industry at Red Lake. Nothing now could stop me in my quest. I was become an unfeeling stone golem, stranger to pain and fatigue, who would stomp any obstacle into dusty oblivion, and all would be crushed mercilessly underfoot. Grasses, flowers, rare mosses, small quadrupeds, hexapeds, octopeds, quatradecimapeds, it doesn't matter how many legs they have. Heaven help them if they find themselves in my path. The descent into the valley of the infant gave me a little tingle of anxiety, though. This is exactly the sort of place I like to get lost. Unfamiliar territory where all the little streams look the same. So I carefully counted out the streams of Red Lake, Dry Lake.
Hang on, didn't I walk up a dry lake yesterday?
Yeah, it's a different one. Hortonsford Bottom and the Woe Lake, before reaching the source of the itself, hidden in a tumble of tinner's rubble. I had one last navigational challenge to overcome, and an old score that needed to be settled. The Abbot's Way, the supposed route that monks took from Buckfast to Tavistock Abbey across the moor. I remember somehow missing this trail on a previous adventure and ending up floundering in a pathless swampy hell. People had assured me that the Abbot's Way exists since, but as a bit of an empiricist I was highly suspicious. If I could find this fabled path, it would be plain sailing all the way to the end. And, luckily, in this desolate place, I bumped into a couple of walkers, one of whom was Moorspike from Instagram, who actually recognised me, because I'm very famous, and pointed me in the right direction. As a helper on my quest, he shall now be known as Geraint, son of Botor, and his walking companion, Philip Parra. Now, some interpretations of the Perambulator's trail takes them to Grimm's grave here, just over another ridge to the west, and I probably would have gone this way if I wasn't, by this point, just unthinkingly following the line on my map. I hope, the route I took is also an accepted version, hence why past George drew it. Anyway, after only a little bumbling, I found a nice broad path heading in the right direction, and Nicholas of Heamton, I'm pretty sure that was him, confirmed that it was indeed the fabled Abbot's Way. Just look at the grin on past George's face. The final river crossing of the trip was the Plym, and in this sheltered, sunny little scoop I settled down to decauliflowerify my feet and munch some lunch.
What in the holy crocodilo bombadilo have we got here? Peanut crocodiles. Would you say he's more an alligator with that snout? Part alligator, part dragon. Pie and key, pie and kai. It's from a part of the world which would have crocodiles rather than alligators. No clue.
Yes, I think you've been alone too long. My next meet was the old tin mining ruins of Islesbarrow, and I knew that from here it would be gravel paths all the way home. But Dartmoor had another surprise for me. I thought it looked like Islesbarrow had a few more gateposts than normal, and as I got closer I saw why. They were soldiers. Now, despite having no idea what had happened in the world in the last 24 hours, I made the assumption that the Russians hadn't paradropped into Sheepstore Parish overnight, and that these were British squaddies out on training, so just wandered through, filming at this entirely intentional Dutch angle. Other than the faintest flicker of a nod from one of them, they completely ignored me, and with steely focus continued their drill, moving absolutely silently through the ruined mine buildings, using only hand signals to coordinate their sweep of the area. And then, maintaining that utter silence, they disappeared over the brow of the hill.
I think they need to keep their heads lower. The bracket's a nice touch though.
My journey was nearing its end, and it was only a case of following these very generous paths to the finish line. Here I had an odd melancholy moment where I felt a bit sad to leave, and for a moment the moor turned grey, almost as if it would miss me too. For about half a second I considered just going around again, like some perambulatory version of Forrest Gump, but on deciding that my family might miss me, made peace with the idea of going home for a hot shower and a pizza. The path to Nuns Cross Farm was inhabited by all manner of cute ponies and adorable calves dozing blissfully in the sun, and I marvelled at how, even on such a beautiful day as this, the old farm building itself managed to look cold and dark and spooky. My meet here was not that eldritch building though, but the ancient Seward's Cross, which stands beside the path here, very much the emblem of the Perambulation. The path towards my final waypoint, South Hessery Tor, was marked by boundary stones, which, as well as making excellent scratching posts for itchy necks, show that the bounds traversed by those 12 knights back in 1240 still have some relevance today, even if in 1967 the Duchy of Cornwall allowed it all to be registered as common land for grazing, with the then Prince Charles presumably bored of blinding peasants for disturbing deer. As I was way ahead of schedule, I took a rest at South Hessery, a very natural place to end a long hike, being as it is only a few minutes from Princetown, and it was fun to watch various travellers and stragglers hobble past, all with their own stories to tell, no doubt. One particularly nice old fella stopped and chatted to me a bit, and we exchanged tales of our adventures. He can complete the dozen, William of Morley. But Dartmoor experts will know South Hessery does have one very special feature that could have great significance to my knight's quest: the sword in the stone. Surely, with the great perambulation all but completed, I would be considered worthy enough to pull this blade from the granite and accept my destiny as the rightful king. Something obviously went wrong. I expect it's because I accidentally skipped that corner at Huntingdon Warren. Oh well. Nothing would dampen my mood, and just when I thought things couldn't get much better, I found myself drifting into the Plume of Feathers for a pint. Well, 2 pints, of the local ale in the sun, before sleepily wobbling down the road to rendezvous with James for my extraction.
Yeah, no, do you know what? I didn't have any problems with blisters at all. Never even.
And there was one last thing to do.
Open my envelope while I'm still on the moors. Oh yeah, I'm getting into this. Oh, no way. Oh, yes. How did he get one of these? Is that his one? Oh, man. Yes, Perambulator.
Well, that was quite an adventure. 12 nights, 4 days, 50 miles, flip knows how much elevation, sun, rain, wind and fog. Bogs, tors, river crossings, grass, mad cows, coconuts, bees, more grass, trenchfoot, naughty ponies and cold pints. Beardy Brother might not agree with me, but if you're up for the challenge, I can't recommend the Perambulation enough. It takes you to some of the moor's most wild and enchanting places, and has just enough lows to make the highs even more magical. As with any challenge like this, you'll learn more about the moor, sure, but I can guarantee you'll learn something about yourself too. Do it your own way, but make sure to contact the bounders for your badge and wear it proudly, so that if we ever meet, we can share a wry nod of recognition from one brave knight to another. Thanks very much for watching this epic to the end, my friends. See you next time.